Hello, my name is Dor Abrahamson. I'm a member of faculty in the Graduate School of Education in beautiful University of California, Berkeley. And I run a lab called the Embodied Design Research Laboratory. Here we go. Where we do design-based research of mathematical cognition, teaching, and learning. Before I start my talk today on embodied design, bringing forth mathematical perceptions, I'd like to begin with this curious habit I have of telling a joke in the local language. So it's a mathematical joke in Mandarin. It goes like this. 确切像有三种人，一种会数数，一种不会。 Which means something like, there are three kinds of people, those who can count and those who cannot. So today's talk about embodied design is primarily on the role of perception, sensory perception in learning mathematical concepts, and how people can learn new mathematical concepts by learning to move physically with their bodies in a new way, and through that develop new perceptions that are, we believe, coming from embodied cognition, new perceptions that are pivotal for thinking mathematically and learning new concepts. So embodied design, what are our framing questions? This is a large research program. Well, in terms of theory, how do you understand a new mathematical concept? Specifically, if cognition is modal activity from the modalities, sensory motor modalities. If mathematical thinking is grounded in sensory motor phenomenology, then how do our sensory and motor capacities assemble to ground a new concept? What is the learning progression from a sensory motor experience to a normative concept? What are critical conditions, components, and events in learning new concepts? In terms of practice, in general, can educators shape students' sensory motor experiences? Specifically, can we foster the embodiment of particular concepts? What forms of technology might enable the training of new sensory motor capacity? And in terms of methods, what types of data would we want in order to evaluate the embodiment paradigm? How do we collect, analyze, and visualize these data? And what theoretical perspectives do these data invite? And what educational futures do they suggest? There have been three developments recently which have converged to enable us to do this, to carry out this research program in terms of theory and methodology and methods. So in terms of theory, we're talking about radical enactivist cognition and radical constructivism. That's the insistence that cognition is a form of modal activity that develops through and for the enactment of situated embodied interactions in the natural cultural environment. So our working hypothesis, derived directly from radical enactivism, is that learning to think in a new way is primarily learning to move in a new way. But how do people learn to move in a new way? Well, luckily there's a century of research in the movement sciences going back to Nikolai Bernstein. With our collaborators, primarily Arthur Bakker in the lab in Utrecht University, our lab has been pioneering the application of the movement sciences, including the complex systems theory of coordination dynamics, to the empirical study of mathematics learning. And we've run what must be the first graduate level seminar on this research. The seminar is now a programmatic requirement for graduate students in the learning sciences at Berkeley. So in terms of technology, we're talking about various embodied interaction platforms like remote sensors and multi-touch tablets, with which we can create environments for people to learn to move in new ways. And the methods are multimodal learning analytics for monitoring a variety of neurobiological markers, such as eye gaze patterns and kinesiological routines, and finding patterns within these big data. All this means we can promote scientific evaluations of embodiment theories of mathematics, design, teaching, and learning. In particular, this convergence of developments in theory, technology, and methodology has enabled our lab to formulate new theory of learning that promotes a view of perception as the pivotal phenomenology in grounding mathematical concepts. We like to say that learning is moving in new ways, By that, we mean both that you learn new mathematical concepts by actually moving in a way you've never moved before. But we also mean that, more generally, the study of human learning is itself moving in new directions. Of course, we're hardly the first people to talk about the need to tailor learning environments to human biological cognitive systems. But where does all this come from? Where does this theory come from? What do I mean by enactivism? So traditionally, and for many years, unfortunately still, people think of the human brain as if it's some kind of computer. So there's been this metaphor as though we have these sensors, the senses coming in, the feeling of touch and taste and smell and sight and hearing. And then once those things come into the brain, there are these symbols that are being processed in the brain, abstract symbols. We come to some inference, and then we decide, oh, let's do this action, okay? So this, as you see, it separates between the brain and the senses and the actuators, the actants, like the hands. Rather, enactivism and other philosophies and theories that have contributed to the embodiment paradigm shift in the cognitive sciences believe that it's all integrated. There's no such thing as abstract symbols in the brain. We're not a computer. Cognition is an enactive activity. Cognition is a sensory motor activity. It is modal. It is using the modalities. There's no thinking that is separate from the being in the world, the being that is due to our biological constitution and our cultural expansions. So the brain is not a computer. It does not process abstract symbols or propositions. The act of thinking mobilizes the same sensory motor modalities by which we function in the natural and sociocultural environment. How we think, therefore, depends on how we know to move in the world, how we know to operate on various objects, and what tools we've mastered, what languages we speak. As such, educators can affect students' cognitive development by shaping their sensory motor experiences with dedicated objects, okay? So there's something I'd like to try with you that will help you understand what I'm talking about. So let's, don't be shy, I'll need you to participate. Use your hands here. So we're going to think of this space here like a Cartesian system. This is the y-axis, this is the x-axis. And I want you to put your hands down on the table, or if you're at the desk or on the sofa, on the arms, or maybe you're on vacation and you're seeing this in a swimming pool, put your hands on the pool side, but move away your drink. Right? We're going to move our hands. So we're going to work with our two hands, and this hand is going up and down along the y-axis. This hand is going left and right along the x-axis. We'll be moving our hands simultaneously, orthogonally, and proportionately. That means for every bit you go up here, you need to go up something over here, and then the same bit, and then something there. So you're going to move this way. Can you do this? Many people tell me it's difficult for them. A lot of people move their hands all over the place, so they cannot coordinate. That's fine. When we tried this with very young children, ages 9, 10, 11, 12, something amazing happened. We saw kids fumbling around, and eventually they were able to do that. And I should say they were doing it with interactive technology. So they don't know what proportion is. We don't tell them what to do. All we say is move this hand, move this hand. Try to make the screen green, because the screen is red. Try to make it green. And I'll tell you, it will only be green when their hands are distances from the point of origin that are according to a certain ratio. For example, this distance is double this distance, okay? So here it will be green, and like here it will be green, and here it will be green. The kids don't know that. They're just like flailing their hands around trying to figure out, and suddenly it's green. And then they try to move their hands again, but they move at the same speed, so it goes red. They fix it. Eventually, suddenly we see the kids moving this way. And we've asked the kids, and these are young children who haven't even studied. A lot of them are low-tracked in vocational schools in the Netherlands. This is the work with Utrecht University collaborators, Arthur Bakker and others. We asked, like, how are you doing? And the kids, oh, the line. So what line are you talking about? Turns out these kids are imagining a diagonal line. Can you see the diagonal line connecting it's an imaginary line, right? There's a diagonal line connecting my hands, all right? it's running here. Now, once you imagine it, see if you can move this line, so to speak, across. All right, we're moving the line. Look at my fingers. Can you see the line? Now, keep imagining the line. The line is moving, but all the while it is keeping the same angle. It is keeping, so that's the new invariant. Now, this is hugely important. This is what today's talk about. We call this a line that popped up, we call it an attentional anchor. We take that from the work of Raul Sanchez Garcia and Daniel Hatto, enactivist cognition, the movement sciences. It turns out that when we're trying to engage the world, and it's a challenge, this bimanual challenge, very often we will look for something, some structure that will help us coordinate. And if we cannot find it, we will generate it. So this line, it's a new gestalt that pops up out of nowhere, connecting the fingers, so to speak. It has this phenomenological facticity. It is real, even though other people cannot see it until they can imagine it with us. For us, it's completely real. And by imagining this line, suddenly the impossible challenge of coordinating this hand this way, this hand that way, suddenly becomes something I can do. I can do it because I'm no longer thinking about this hand and this hand. All I'm thinking about is this line. I'm moving the line, moving it to the left. You see, it is moving across. So this is an attentional anchor. It's anchoring my attention into the environment. Nothing represented, no content, so to speak. I just figured out how to see the world. The world is now affording, the environment is affording me the enactment of this movement that satisfied the task specifications. So that, the screen will be green and stay green. So this perceptual anchor then enables me to start talking about things like, for example, look at this triangle and this triangle. So you see, this is a right angle triangle that is dilating, all the while keeping the same ratio between the three lines. So we can talk about trigonometric functions, geometrical similitude, ratio and proportion. We can talk about the graphs. Now, at a certain point, we put a grid onto the screen, and then we look to see what happens when that grid comes up. Now, for us, that's a very important moment. It's the moment where there begins a sort of negotiation between these tacit ways of figuring out how to move, which are part of our biological endowment, of evolutionarily endowed capacity to learn to move in new ways. And on the other hand, all this, cultural, mathematical stuff, all the heritage, epistemic forms, cognitive tools, and enhancers and amplifiers that our civilization has come up with. So we'll be getting back to this interesting connection, which you'll see. I'll bring this picture of the birth of Adam, the child and culture, and how technology can help in this process. Okay, so hopefully you've managed to do this, and I'll say just more about this attentional anchor. That you were given a challenging task. There were two simultaneous yet independent motor action patterns. There was online sensory feedback to evaluate performance. Well, usually the kids would get green, but here you had to evaluate yourself by proxy, because I don't have the technology to show you at this moment. But despite understanding the goal, keep this proportion, we faced a sensory motor overload. We somehow needed to relate across the actions so as to coordinate them. So we needed a common frame of reference, if you will, an auxiliary construction, an imaginary one. And then I introduced this for you as supplementary form, and I articulated it as a goal structure. Keep this, this thing going across, this diagonal moving. The goal structure it's an object anchored in the world, at least in your perception, and you yourself generated and maintained the structure. There is no real diagonal thing here. It's something that you brought. You brought in from your own perception. You're projecting it, okay? And you attended to the structure, and it collapsed two jobs, 1 and 2, onto a single job of moving the line. Right? The challenging task became a single co-anchored bimanual coordination, and the structure served as an artifact. It's an imaginary tool, but it's a tool, it's an artifact, it's a cultural thing that mediated the enactment. The successful enactment was suddenly magical. Whoa. Then it became normal, and your attention could shift from the mediating structure to the independent elements of performance and think more about them, how they are operating. And the structure mediated concerting, you and I can be talking about it. I can check what you're doing because I know how you're thinking about it, our interpersonal coordination. It's easy to teach, to learn, to mark, to document and remember. We can copy it onto paper. And once represented in language, it becomes like this is new ontology. It's a thing that we can speak about. We like to think of this attentional anchor as an epistemic liminal, okay? It's epistemic liminal between this tacit know-how, this very animalistic thing of learning to move in a new way, and the mathematical, cultural tools of thinking about it, reflecting about it, being conscious of it. So it's this epistemic liminal between know-how and know that. Yeah. Okay, so that's the attentional anchor. So COVID days. Any of you been in Rome recently to the Vatican? You look up, you'll see a work by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel. So I'd like to think of Adam as, you know, endowed with biological cognitive systems, like a kid, like comes to the world. The kid is born. How will this kid learn mathematics? And oh yes, sorry. And I'd like to think of you know, God or the deity as like the cultural forms. Bear with me. This may not be your religion or faith, but it's just for the metaphor. And so yeah, God is like the teacher, bringing the child these forms, this knowledge, this mathematics. And COVID days. So this is a learning environment, and I'd like to focus on this place where there will be a negotiation between, on the one hand, the biological cognitive systems, and on the other hand, the cultural forms. So let's focus here. By the way, notice that Adam, or the child, has the upper hand. Only the focus brings that out. And we'll look here between, and we're talking about the roles of technologies in facilitating a negotiation between biological cognitive systems and cultural forms. We're looking to see how a child and a teacher, so to speak, are in this dialogue where a child can maintain the biological cognitive systems, expand from them, extend through them, through the cultural forms, to gain greater fluency, greater competence, greater ability to navigate the world. So in the words of Art Glenberg, we're looking for future development of technology that is sensitive to the principles of biological cognitive systems. It's a paper from 2006 about distributed cognition. So embodied design. Embodied design, our design framework, our research program, we're looking to create, thinking of natural learning as goal-oriented sensory motor adaptation to ecological contingencies, including cultural forms and practices. So this is coming from enactivism. So embodied design, our framework, it's a pedagogical framework where we are simulating naturalistic learning by creating instructional activities that foster the development of sensory motor schemes for better motor control. These new sensory motor schemes evolved centered on attentional anchors, which are perceptual structures for engaging the environment. When mathematical forms are introduced into the environment, students adopt them as potentially enhancing the enactment, evaluation, or explanation of their sensory motor solution strategies. So remember, we're talking about this. So far, you've seen just that. But then I said the grid comes up. And suddenly, there's this new epistemic form, this new resource. What do we do with it? Soon we'll be talking about what happens at that moment where symbolic artifacts are introduced into the learning environment. As we've seen, kids pick them up originally as trying to do better what they were doing before. So they're enhancing the enactment, or maybe they're enhancing the evaluation. Is this right? Using the grid or explanation. So here's what I'm trying to do, right? But in the course of adopting the apparent utilities or affordances in these symbolic artifacts, we see the kids shift, right? From the biological cognitive system, they shift into the cultural forms, into a new reperception of what it is they're doing, but it's still grounded in these ways of working. More about that later. So enactivism, where everything is coming from, the work of Varela, Thompson, and Roche. In a nutshell, the enactive approach consists of 2 points. Perception consists in perceptually guided action. I mean, perception is inherently for action. Okay, that is our evolutionary heritage and our purview. It's our fundamental neural architecture. It's our quintessential epistemic mode of ecological function. And cognitive structures, like this attentional anchor, they emerge from the recurrent sensory motor patterns that enable action to be perceptually guided. So for folks like us in math ed research, the cognitive structures we most care about are ontologies that will become mathematical concepts. So these are the attentional anchors, and the sensory motor patterns are the hand motor action and visual sensation that increasingly assemble to organize coordinated perception for action. So we're very much interested in how these attentional anchors suddenly emerge, they pop up, so to speak, out of nowhere, or as an activist say, they come forth. Whereas ecological psychologists say the environment affords that. Those were affordances we had to find and detect and use. So embodied design draws on enactivism, and I operate in kind of reverse engineering. So I ask myself, so what is a mathematical concept I want kids to learn? For example, proportionality. And then I say, so what are the cognitive structures that would enable proportionality to be embodied and enacted? And I might think about this diagonal line and say, oh, okay, so these cognitive structures, what kind of sensory motor patterns would they come from? Ah, okay, moving this way and that way. And then I say, all right, so what is the action? This is an action, this is an action that has to be perceptually guided. Need to figure this out. So this is kind of the reverse engineering in building these environments. So let's take a case study. Let's go back 12 years now. Imagine that you want you're pouring like 2 blue cups and 3 yellow cups into a tub. So you get 5 cups worth of green color. And now say you have more or less double and amount you want, and you have 4 cups. I said double the amount, but I'm already slipping in the way I think about it. And the question is how many cups, of yellow? Now ask any mathematics teacher or all of you folks in mathematics education research. We all know kids have lots of trouble adapting multiplicative structures, moving into rational numbers, right? So they go something like, all right, 2 more cups of blue. So we need 2 more yellow cups. Is that 5? Or they say this way. Let's see, here there's 1 more. 3 is 1 more than 2. So here, 1 more, would that be 5? Well, see, they're applying their additive ways of thinking, but it just so happens that this context is inappropriate for that. And so the question would be like, how can they get feedback and how can they grow from their additive thinking to multiplicative thinking, given that things like paint are tricky to use in the class and mixtures of flavors. So how can you make this embodied? Now, we know that this is the solution, but how can we help kids understand? So we're in search of an embodied design for proportional equivalence. The first thing we came up with way back, and now I'm going to share with you something that we thought at the time is the solution. But then, as you see, it turned out it's not the solution, but I have to share this with you as a designer, a design-based researcher, so that you understand how we operate in design-based research. So I'm going to show you something that doesn't work, all right? But let's see why. So in this case, you see, this is Mark Howison. This is Becky Blessing. Mark built this contraption in 2008 or 2009, something like that. And you see, he's cranking here this pulley, and Becky is holding on to the ropes. Now, notice that these wheels are of different diameter. In fact, it's 2 per 3. That's why, even though both of these are turning according to the same motion that Mark is performing here on the same axle, nevertheless, this rope and this rope are turning at different speeds. They're rising at 2 per 3 and then going down at 2 per 3. Now we thought, hooray, Becky is experiencing proportion. What more do we need? Well, it turns out it doesn't work too well because, look, Becky, something was missing because Becky doesn't have to be active. She can fall asleep for all she cares. Things just happen to her. She does not devise a strategy. She does not receive feedback. And she's not surprised by any conflict. She doesn't need to accommodate and does not have any tools to mathematize her experience. So we moved on to digital tools. Yeah, we call this mathematics imagery trainer number one, which suggests that it's not the only one. Just around then, Johnny Chung Lee figured out how to hack Wiimote so that he can move objects on the screen remotely just by moving his fingers. And so we said, hey, let's do this as well. So we built the mathematics imagery trainer number 2. So the way it works, I mean, these are lots of arrows. It looks very fancy. Basically, it's one of those remote control things where it's going through the sensor, but the child experiences as if she's moving these virtual objects. So this is what it looks like. This is my kid, Naomi. She's now a rising senior. But back then, she had no idea that she's learning proportion. So if before we spoke about this, right, the orthogonal motions that you learn to perform, we're going to do a simpler one here where they're parallel. Both of them are going up and down. So now lateral movement is not important, right? So the child comes into a room and they see some screen, and the screen is red. And we say to them, move your hands to make the screen green. Now, as I said before, they try moving one hand, it's still red. That hand is still red. Both hands, so they flail. Suddenly it's green. Now, why is it green? Because like before, the height here of the left hand or cursor over the bottom of the screen and the height of this right cursor over the bottom of the screen, these two heights relate by a certain ratio that I've set on the control. For example, 1/2, right? So the screen is green now, and we say to the kid, okay, great. Now move your hands, keeping it green. Now, once again, the child is pre-proportional. They don't know what they're doing. Oh, you know, this crazy guy asked me to make this thing green. All right, it's green. What now? So they look around, they say, well, there's no frames of reference. There's nothing to hang on to. They're just my two dear hands here, the two cursors on the screen. What can I do? There must be some kind of method in this madness, right? This is the didactic contract, right, from Rousseau. They know something's going on here. I need to figure something out. So I need to keep something the same so that the feedback will be the same. Now, how am I going to do it? Well, all I have is my hands, and all I know is to keep this distance the same. They might look at the vertical distance, or they might look maybe at kind of a diagonal line. Okay, I'm going to keep this the same. So they raise their hands, keeping the same distance. And well, you know where this is going. The screen goes red. Why does it go red? Because they've violated the ratio. Instead of, right, going up this way, they've gone up this way. Can you see the difference? It's been between moving at different speeds. They've moved at the same speed, like move this distance up, and the screen goes red. Now, for us, this is hugely important because we believe this is a diagnosis. This is an active assessment of what the child knows, right? It is not the case that the kid goes, oh, yes, shoot, I tried the additive. Let's try the proportional. Ah, la la da, here we are, and it's green again. No, they don't, because they don't have proportional enactment as in their embodied repertory. It's not something that exists for them. It's not something that they've ever performed before. They have never in their life moved the hands at different speeds. It's just something that doesn't exist in their enactive repertory. So we can see it. And we say this moment of raising the two hands like that, this is precisely the same thing as the error we talked about earlier when we were speaking about these things over here. It's precisely the same error, okay? And so we say like, okay, so where is it going to go? And what happens is the kids have moved up and it went red. They're still thinking like, you know, Karbilov-Smith. They still have the theory. Oh, I still believe that it should be the same, only I messed up in the execution of this thing. So they kind of fix it. They fix it and it goes green. And then again, red, and they fix it. After a certain point, they go, well, they say these convoluted sentences. Well, it's kind of like I told you, it should be the same, only it should grow. And at some point, they start prefixing it and they understand, oh, okay, it's the higher my hands go, the bigger the difference needs to be, okay? This is just one of many strategies that you can figure out in order to perform this correctly. We've seen lots more kids figuring out, oh, this has to move double as fast as that. This is always half as high. This is, oh, and Rob Goldstone came up with an amazing strategy. He told me, we were sitting in a bar in Berkeley at Comal, and I'm telling him about this thing, and suddenly he goes, okay, Dor, I've got it. And he moves perfectly like that. Say, Rob, how are you doing this? He says, well, what do you think? And I tried all my stuff on him and he said, no. Eventually he said, you know, Dor, you wanted it to go up at 1/2. So I'm secretly imagining a point down here, equally distance on the other side. And I'm looking to there and I'm making sure that my hands are going up in a straight line where anchored down here at that imaginary point, this point and that point are going like that. You want 1/3? No problem. You want 2/3? No problem. So just like the kids are looking at this distance, Professor Rob Goldstone was looking at this point down here. That was his attentional anchor. So kids do this in many ways, and we don't always know. But then when we brought in the eye tracking, we could tell what it is they're doing. Okay. So once again, they start out by moving the hand, and at a certain point, we enter symbolic artifacts, because the kids have already said the higher I go, the bigger the distance is, and we bring in a grid. And this is the point where Adam speaks to God, where the child, the biological cognitive systems speak to the cultural forms that come in. This is stuff, this is civilization, this is a grid. These are equidistant parallel lines. This is civilization's heritage epistemic form or mathematical tools. And when this comes in, the kids go, oh, okay. Next thing we know, the kids say, oh, for every one I go on the left, I need to go 2 to the right, because their hand is sort of grasped onto this frame of reference. But in the course of using this mathematical instrument as some kind of figural handle on the world, in the course of doing that, they have shifted into a new way of thinking. If before we had a continuous space, now we have a discrete space. If before we were moving simultaneously, now we're moving sequentially. If before we were using qualitative language, the higher I go, the bigger it gets. Here we're using quantitative language. For every 1 on the left, I go 2 on the right. And eventually they'll be able to move again simultaneously, but thinking about these units, so that we've created a new embodied and active way for thinking about what will become proportion, right? So just stepping back for a moment, if you think about simple arithmetic, say addition, what does it mean to add? People say, adding stuff. They'll gesture this way, or maybe stack it this way or that way, accumulate it, various ways of adding. If you say, what is multiplication? People might go 3 times 2 is 2 and 2 and 2. So like gyrating at the wrist with this iterated composite unit, as Les Steffi called it. But in so doing, also kind of going along some kind of projection, this kind of motion. But if you ask them what is a proportion, most often, try that, ask people. They no longer know what to do, to enact. They go, oh, if you have these numbers. So they shift out of their body onto these symbols, onto the algorithms, and that they don't really understand. Susan Jarowski might say, they're no longer being the mathematics. They're just tracing it. They're not embodying, enacting it. And that's our fault, because we haven't given them ways of enacting those mathematical concepts. So around when fractions enter the scene, there's this epistemic crisis where you can no longer be the mathematics and becomes that stuff that kids talk about they want me to do that. They're telling me to do this, okay? So we're giving them an enactive proportion. So enter symbolic artifacts, and then numerals, and eventually we bring in this kind of driver, we call it, where kids put in the numbers. So we're shifting into the cultural forms, and we track how kids make green, initially getting it wrong, and then looking at the expansion. The grid comes in, the numerals comes in, they go into multiplicative thinking, and we're curious how these things emerge, and looking at this, so to speak, divide with additive multiplicative, but how that multiplicative is grounded in the additive and regrounded back into the additive. So this is what it looks like when a child is actually doing that. So she's raising her hands. And if you look here on the screen, you'll see the cursors she's moving. And notice how the vertical gap between her hands is increasing as her hands go up, and then decreasing as her hands start going down. The interviewer researcher here is Dr. Dragan Krninic, now at ETH in Zurich. So this is just before the grid comes on, I believe. Okay. And as I said, we've tried it with various technologies. So we've TerraSoft has built us the first tablet, which you can download at tinyurl.com, free MITP. There have been many versions. FunExpected is the company I work with in Moscow, has built this version where you need to make sure that this cute animal doesn't fall off by moving these two pulleys. And oh, for COVID days, we actually expanded it. So kids in different homes who are not in this, who are sitting at completely different places can collaborate remotely, where one kid takes the left, the other kid takes the right. And recently FET at Colorado, led by Emily Moore, has created a version that is for accessibility and inclusion. So it includes various kinds of sonification and tactile feedback for blind students. Right, we've taken it to schools, and you can see.
Grab it, then we're gonna go.
Try making.
No.
Oh, together.
Yeah, together. Go back to 5.
Yes.
Go back to 5.
What we're seeing here is that the kids are operating the tablet together, and that's fascinating. This is kind of the latter-day Wittgenstein, because in order to work together, they need to create a common reference. They need language. They need ways of referring to those things that they're asking each other to do in order to coordinate, in order to concert. So mathematical concepts emerge through a need to solve a pragmatic problem of coordinating the joint enactment of a two-person movement that will solve this task specifications so that they can perform the task correctly. Let's move on. Where are we now? So in Utrecht, meanwhile, my collaborators, Arthur Bakker and others, started using eye tracking. So here you see a tablet, and on the tablet will be this kind of work or that kind of work. But also here are eye trackers. You can see this is like the desk, and it's clasped to it. There are eye trackers which are looking to see where the children are gazing. So you see these orange dots, these orange blobs. The orange blobs tell us where the children are looking. Here in the case of the parallels, and here in the case of the orthogonals. So now we know not only what the kids' actions are and what they're saying and gesturing to us, but where they are looking. And this, in turn, will enable us to figure out how new perceptions are coming forth. So this is the wonderful team led by Arthur. And let's move on to a case. So here we see this is where children are looking, how they are looking in the various tasks. And for example, looking this way in order to move the hands in parallel. We see the attentional anchors coming up. What I'd like to do is to show you in more detail the one that this task I've been speaking about before, okay? So here's a child, I think around 10 or 11, in a low-tracked curriculum in a vocational school in the Netherlands. And what we're seeing here was absolutely typical of what kids would do. These kids who don't understand proportion, all they're told, the screen is red, make it green. Just like you were trying earlier, they're moving this hand here and this hand here. Notice where their eyes are. This kid, the eyes are on this finger and on the other finger, right? The eyes are on the fingers for the most. Where should I go along the axis? Up here. And then suddenly this eyes goes here. What's there? Why are the kids looking there? What's happening here on the screen? That's a strange thing. Why would they look on the screen? Why would they look away from their fingers onto this area? There are no stimuli, no contours, nothing to see, in a sense. But it turns out there's something. Something to, what would another verb be? To imagine, to behold, to perceive, things to perceive that are not really there. So At a certain point,
verder weg, die rechter dan die linker?
The interviewer is asking him, the kid, so how are you doing this? And he says, oh yes, it needs to remain in line. Did you catch that? Let's look at that moment again.
Is dan deze ook verder weg, die rechter dan die linker?
Ja, wel iets, maar het blijft wel zeg maar op één lijn zo.
Blijft wel op één lijn.
Ich mag bleiben mag in line. He's speaking Dutch. It must remain in a line. Now, at the time, even though we were tracking the eyes, we were gathering the data, but the interviewer in real time did not have access to that data. She doesn't know what he's talking about, the line, and she's going, yeah, sure, fine, the line. It was only later when we started tracking the eyes, looking at the eye tracking data, which is what we're showing you here, it was only then that we could see what the child is doing.
Nog een keertje dan weer bij het begin beginnen?
You'll notice now the child.
En dan dus weer naar buiten toe, terwijl je het scherm groen houdt.
His hands orthogonally, and the eyes are no longer on the fingers. The eyes are going to be somewhere on the screen in between. And this is precisely what we're talking about. This is the new attentional anchor. This is how perception comes forth as an active way of solving the pragmatic problem of coordinating the two independent motor actions of the left and the right hand. This is the kid who's talking about a new thing they're seeing. And notice how the eyes every so often go back to the origin. Can you see how they're going back to the origin and tracking along that line? This kid is seeing.
Kan je nog een keertje dan weer dus bij het begin beginnen?
Line. The kid is seeing this imaginary line that is guiding their motion, and they're moving the line to the side. Okay, so this is what we can see with eye tracking. This is perception coming forth as a solution, a pragmatic solution. So let me rush ahead. The kid's eyes are going up along this trajectory, which might in fact, you can think of it as a function of y equals half x. Other kids gave other solutions. They said, oh, I'm not looking at the diagonal. They said, I'm completing this. I'm looking up here at the coordinate pair, so to speak, as like closing this rectangle as I go up. So there are multiple solutions. And in fact, a great deal of our interest is how children themselves and among each other, so intrapersonal, interpersonal, how they coordinate the different visualizations and learn through that. And when teachers know how these things look, it's even better, because now teachers can talk to kids about imaginary things. The teacher and child are looking together at the screen, and they're talking about these imaginary lines that we know about only because we've done the eye tracking. And later on, kids can kids who have done this problem can then work on paper, and those imaginary lines then become things that they can actually inscribe and measure and quantify, figure out the quotients, etc. This is in the dissertation, the master's work of Tai Bongers, you can read. So we've worked with other kinds of concepts. We've done dual eye tracking, where we operate both the child and the teacher with eye trackers and use that in order to think about theory such as Vygotsky, so dual eye tracking, Vygotsky, worked with trigonometry, etc. So it's time to get towards our conclusions. And this has been some help for us. Okay, I'm going to zip through these, lots of other stuff you can read on about on our website. Lots of fascinating work, and recently complex dynamic systems. And I'd like to conclude now. Mathematical concepts are grounded in the sensory motor perceptions that emerge as practical solutions for the efficient enactment of ecologically coupled movements. Sociocultural reframing of these sensory motor perceptions occurs through the timely mediation of symbolic artifacts. Students adopt these artifacts spontaneously as readily available means of enhancing their goal-oriented actions, yet in so doing, they appropriate heritage conceptual systems that enable them to participate in the social enactment of mathematical practice. Educational designers can engineer and facilitate this process. So I've spoken to you about learning is moving in new ways, and why we view sensory perception emerging from an attempt to move, to operate in certain ways on the world. these perceptions that emerge, how they can be pivotal in this epistemic liminal from know-how to know that, and how we can engineer environments to make this happen. Thank you very much. You're most welcome to come to the website to see our papers and to write to me with any further questions. Thank you.